what they believe is self-refuting. You're not talking about Huck Finn anymore. You're talking about 30 different ways of reading Huck Finn. The same thing happens when you're reading the Constitution. Same thing happens when you're reading the Bible.
Well, I am joined by my friend Don Williams today. Donald T. Williams is how you can find him online. And he's a literary scholar, he's a philosopher and a pastor. And he taught English, right? You taught mainly English and philosophy at Tacoma Fall for 35 years.
Yeah, I was the medieval and Renaissance guy in the English department. That was my official position. But the small Christian college is the last refuge of the Renaissance man. And so I got to teach a little theology. I got to teach our apologetics course. I had all kinds of fun and got into all kinds of mischief for 30 some odd years, very odd years.
Excellent. So Don's one of those guys where he's smart, but he also is wise and discerning. And so he's someone that is well worth listening to whenever we get a chance to do that. So today, the topic that we're going to talk about is something that may seem kind of overly academic, but it is, I think, immensely practical. I think it's something that we overlook frequently, and it has a lot to do with how we reason and how we gain information today, which is about reading. It's about how we actually go about getting information from a text. And we don't do a lot of book reading today, but Don, correct me if I'm wrong, but this has to do with any kind of reading. So even down to text messages, probably, how you interpret information. Since we're in a society that is obviously very different than it was maybe 200 years ago, what is the essential shift that's happened between then and now, between how people read a text then and interpreted a text then? So any book, any article, newspaper, whatever, versus now.
The default assumptions have changed in some pretty radical ways. For most of the history of reading, the assumption was that when you create a text, and by text, I mean any kind of verbal communication, doesn't have to be written down. So when you say something, whether you say it out of your mouth or whether you write it down, whatever, you have a message you're trying to communicate. And so you choose words, you choose symbols to try to communicate it. And the person who receives it is trying to interpret it, meaning he's trying to figure out what you were trying to say to him, but he's receiving a message from you. So if we're having a conversation, you're listening to me, or if you pick up one of my books and try to read it, the assumption is that there is a meaning in the text because I put it there for you to receive. And what you're trying to do is receive it, to understand what I was actually talking about, what I actually tried to communicate. But that default setting has changed, I would say, for most people. And one of the things that really concerns me is that I taught in a very conservative Christian religious college, and even the majority of the students there had come in with this new assumption, which is that a text has no meaning until it's interpreted. It was really educational to eat in the cafeteria and talk with students, because they would say things in that setting that they wouldn't have dared to put on their hermeneutics exam to please their Bible professor. What I discovered is that they just assume that readers create the meaning, okay? Whatever the author was doing when he created the text, when he made the statement, recorded it, whatever, that was just the opportunity for the reader. The text doesn't mean anything until you read it. And then the reader is the one that creates the meaning. And different readers will create different meanings depending on their background, their interests, just what they're bringing to the table with their mind. The problem with this, and it was, uh, I mean, there are several different forms of it that you run into in academia. One of them is called reader response criticism. And the problem with it is that it's completely self-refuting. So I'm sitting across the table and the student is telling me that the text has no meaning until she interprets it. And she creates the meaning, not the author. She's not limited to the meaning the author put there. No, she creates her own meaning out of the raw material of the text. And I'm saying, okay, so you're telling me that the text means what the author meant it to mean. No, 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 that's what I'm denying. Well, yeah, but if what you said is true, then I'm the one who creates the meaning of your statement. And I think it means the very opposite of what you're trying to tell me. And then you just get this blank stare because they can't process the fact that what they believe is self-refuting. In other words, you want me to make a good faith effort to understand what you are actually trying to tell me. And don't tell me you don't care about this because you'll be lying. You want me to make a good faith effort to understand what you meant when you said it, not just take it as an opportunity to create my own meaning. Well, then the golden rule, the hermeneutical golden rule comes into play. That is, you therefore have a moral obligation to grant the same courtesy to other authors, living or dead. You can't just treat their text, their statement, their conversation. You can't just treat it as raw material out of which you create your own meaning because you won't let me do that with yours.
Right. Can you real quick give a definition of hermeneutics for everyone?
I mean, what we now call it used to be called hermeneutics, but after gender neutral language, we've changed it to No, hermeneutics is from Hermes, the Greek god of communication, the messenger of the gods, and it is the study of how to interpret text, how to interpret documents, or how to interpret any kind of communication. So hermeneutics is studying what are the correct and proper rules that allow you to accurately interpret documents. So yeah, we're talking about hermeneutics, and two different philosophies of it. One is the author put the meaning in the text. I've got to try to figure out what that is, and I can get it right or wrong. And the other approach is I, the reader, create the meaning of the text uh, based on whatever I bring to it. And there is no right or wrong because the meaning can be different for any given interpretive community. That's the technical term, which just is a fancy way of saying the readers. So yeah, we're talking about this big paradigm shift. And the new paradigm is self-contradictory. And if you believe that there's any validity to the golden rule, it's immoral. Because if you expect me to make a good faith effort to understand you, then you've got to grant the same courtesy to me and to every author, living or dead. And if you refuse to do that, you have just confessed that you are guilty of intellectual bankruptcy that is rooted in moral bankruptcy, because you're claiming a right for yourself that you deny to everybody else.
Right. This is one of those areas I think where um, we we already have problems on social media with people um, not putting a complete thought together when they respond to one another or read someone's ideas. But now, if this is the case where what is meant by the author doesn't matter as much as how what you think about it or how you feel about it, then our communication on social media is doomed to be far worse than it would be otherwise. So it's a huge, huge, huge problem that can turn into complete and total chaos pretty quickly.
Well, It's bad. It has a bad rep in any case.
Yeah.
Yeah. And, what you put out is an important point, because authorial intention, or originalism are the technical names for the old way of receiving meaning from the author. We look for the author. What was the author trying to say? It's called authorial intention. And people respond, people defending the new way respond, and they say, well, people don't always communicate what they meant to communicate. And that's quite true, as about half of the things you read on the internet demonstrate. So authorial intention is not necessarily the end of the process of interpretation, but it has to be the beginning. Okay. You can legitimately conclude that even though I meant to say X, I actually said Y, but you can't conclude that unless you think that what I meant to say matters. Okay. So people sometimes don't communicate what they set out to communicate. Sometimes they communicate more. I mean, I've had the interesting experience of being a guest lecturer in a class or English class, and the students don't know who I am. I mean, I've been introduced. They haven't been told that I'm the actual author of the poem that they're reading, and I sit there and listen to them interpreting it. And sometimes they'll see something in it that I didn't know I had put there, but it's really there. And so whether it was subconsciously or just by luck, the text might mean more than what I intended to say. And if I'm an incompetent communicator, it might mean less than what I intended to say. But my point is, you can't ignore authorial intention, which is what the standard way that people are taught to read and interpret today is. You ignore the author's intention. And I'm saying you can't do that, because if you do, you're contradicting yourself and you're breaking the hermeneutical golden rule. But that is exactly how people are taught to deal with text today.
When do you think that changed?
Yeah, it started back in the 30s, 40s, and 50s with a movement in English literature called the New Criticism. By the way, the New Criticism is now very old, but it seemed like a good name at the time. These guys were trying to figure out what to do with this new subject, English literature. You see, up until that point, it was inconceivable that people would need to go to school to learn to read their own literature in their own language. You went to school to learn to read Latin and Greek literature in Latin and Greek. You needed extra help to do that. You had to go to school to do that, but you didn't need to be taught how to read Mark Twain or Charles Dickens or somebody like that, because that was part of your own language and culture. But then at the end of the 19th century, moving into the 20th century, the schools decided, well, we need to have English and American literature as a subject. And the teachers are trying to figure out, well, what do we do with it? Because when it was Latin or Greek, the teacher had a job. He or she had some explaining to do, because it wasn't self-evident to people who weren't part of that language or culture what the text meant. And so they originally put a lot of emphasis on the author's biography, the author's philosophy, and tried to find that in the text, which sometimes is worth doing. But the new critic said, wait a minute, is that what literature is about? Do I really read a story like Huck Finn to try to figure out what Mark Twain's philosophy was? I mean, it might be there, it might be relevant, but no, literature is a work of art, and it has its own rules, and we need to study it as a work of art. And a lot of what they brought forth was valid and right and healthy, but they made a couple of mistakes. And one of them was they came up with this concept called the intentional fallacy. What they taught was that it's a fallacy to try to figure out what the author intended because once he's created the text, it's an artifact, it's a work of art, it stands on its own. You may not have access to the author. You can't ask him what he intended. Don't worry about that. Just look at the text and let the text tell you. The text will tell you what the text means. Don't worry about the author. He's gone. And so the problem with that is, of course, they were right if, up to a point. When you create a text, it now has its own independent existence, and you can no longer control what people do with it. But they took that a step too far and then created this contradiction, because did the new critics, people like Clint Brooks and Wimsatt and Beardley and John Clare Ransom, did they intend for you to ignore the author's intention when they tried to teach you the intentional fallacy? Yeah, I think they did. And they did. Okay. And so this opened the door to the problems we have today. Now, the new critics would have been horrified to dream about what later people have done with their idea, taking it farther than they would have done. But when you move from the 30s and the 50s, when these guys created this, it dominated English departments, high school and college English teaching from the 50s through about the 80s of the 20th century. When you're doing that in the context of the radical relativism that has taken over, then it becomes extremely toxic, and it produces the situation we have today, where reader response criticism, which isn't necessarily bad. I mean, it's certainly legitimate to ask how readers react to a text and what that tells us about the nature of the text. C.S. Lewis practiced reader response criticism in his book, An Experiment in Criticism, and he shows you how it's possible to do it responsibly without running into these problems. Lewis was saying, if you want to know if a book is great literature, examine the way people read it. What kind of reading does it promote and encourage in its readers? If you can just read the thing for information once and then file it and forget it, that's one thing. If, like the fans of The Lord of the Rings, you keep coming back to it and reading it, rereading it, wanting to live in that world, that tells you something about the way the readers tend to react to a text, tells you something about the text, and that's true. But then you add the radical relativism that has taken over since that time. The 70s were kind of a transitional decade. In the 80s, postmodernism was taking over the academy. And so the mistake of the new critics, which was taking some of their ideas too far, not realizing that they had created a contradiction, became a dogma for the postmodern critics. And you have a guy like Stanley Fish, who is the poster child for reader response criticism. And his most famous book is entitled, Is There a Text in This Class? And so with all of his cleverness, he analyzes what's happening when students are reading a text, and takes all of the different responses they may have, and with his relativistic background and set of assumptions, very cleverly makes it seem like there is no text. The answer, is there a text in the class, is no, or else there's 31, one for each student and one for the teacher, because he can make it look like each one is reading it differently. And so the text that the author wrote actually vanishes. It disappears, evaporates, and there's nothing left except the reader's subjectivity. And, that's where we are.
Yeah. which means there's nothing to discuss.
Well, they discuss is the interpretations. So the text becomes the mat in the gym on which you do your own hermeneutical gymnastics. And you're not really talking about the text anymore. You're talking about how brilliant somebody's reading of the text was. In other words, they had a really nice routine of intellectual gymnastics they performed with the text as their mat on which they performed this. And oh, those were brilliant moves that this person made, and he stuck his landing, etc. And he gets tens from the professors. But you're not talking about Huck Finn anymore. You're talking about 30 different ways of reading Huck Finn. And the actual thing that Mark Twain wrote has pretty much evaporated and vanished. So readings are praised for their brilliance. They're praised for being transgressive, because if you can figure out a way to read something like homosexuality or transgenderism into the text, then obviously you're the ultimate of what academia is all about, and that's what you're praised for: being transgressive, not being faithful.
Yeah. It seems like new storytelling has a tendency to fixate on just being subversive or transgressive itself rather than telling a good story and really focusing on the classic elements of what makes a story great.
Well, yeah, that's what secular literature professors value, and the students are going to do whatever the professor values because the student wants to get a good grade.
That's
And
true.
so it's a kind of an insidious setup. And people
Yeah.
are influenced by it in ways they don't even realize are happening. Now, this isn't just about reading literature, and it's not about reading literature in school, okay? Because the same thing happens when you're reading the Constitution. Same thing happens when you're reading the Bible, okay? Yeah, we happen to have a conservative Supreme Court right now, but the theory of reading the Constitution that people are being taught in law school, all we need is the wrong president to appoint a couple of wrong people, and all of a sudden we're back to where the Constitution has no meaning. And the Constitution means whatever 5 out of 9 people in black robes think it ought to mean, or want it to mean, or think it should mean. Then when Christians are reading the Bible, I can tell you, because I taught these guys, even if they think the Bible is the word of God, if they have this idea that it's up to the reader to create the meaning of the text, guess what happens to the authority, even of the Bible? The authority is transferred to the reader. And so, this is connected to the level of biblical illiteracy in the churches. It's connected to the gap between what Christian life is supposed to be and what a lot of people are actually living. Many studies have shown that the Bible has only a minimal influence on the actual lives of people who believe in it. So if and I'm making these figures up because I don't remember the actual ones, but they represent the reality. So if the average age for first experience of fornication for the general public is 15, for young people in conservative Christian churches, it'll be like 16 or 17. Like the Bible delays that sin for a whole year. Oh, wow. We're doing such a good job of discipling our young people. But you see, the problem is that in this hermeneutic, in this way of reading and interpreting, which is what everybody's being taught. If you go to the public schools, Now, they may not use some of the technical terms for it that I've used, but they're basically teaching you that this is how you read. And if you go to secular colleges, it's explicitly taught that this is how you read. And even in Christian colleges, more than you would, Christians would be absolutely scandalized if they knew what was being taught in some of their own schools, because the PhD pretty much is a union card for college teaching now, and there are practically zero schools where you can get a PhD that aren't teaching this kind of stuff. And so, in order to get your doctorate, you have to spend at least 3 years pretending to respect and take seriously this self-contradictory and immoral approach to reading, because you won't get your degree otherwise. And 3 years of doing that, it rubs off on you in ways you don't even realize are happening. And then you take a job at a Christian college, and the administrators who are determining whether or not you get hired don't know anything about theology. All they know about is how to raise money. And so if you say the right pious stuff and sing the right praise choruses, then hey, fine, they'll hire you. And you're undermining the ability of the next generation of Christians to interpret the Bible and to live by the Bible, because in this system, the authority of the text disappears. The authority is transferred from the text to the reader. It means whatever you feel like you want or need it to mean. And so when people are encouraged to read their own meaning into the text rather than exhorted to find the author's meaning there, this is putting the foxes in charge of the hen house when fallen human nature runs up against the law of God.
That's well said. Yeah. And we have a culture that does not like authority already, that has a distrust of authority and wants to have the self be the authority. And that shows up everywhere across the board. And I think that this is very tempting for that type of person already, to try to read text this way, to come at a text as though you are the authority and the author is not the authority. And that is so dangerous for so many reasons. And it's one of those things that I think we need to, in the chaos of the modern world, reclaim, so that we have something to ground ourselves in, where we can say, all right, everybody's saying a different thing about the Bible, for example, or about the Constitution, for example. Well, how do I know what it says? What if I go study it to figure out what it was trying to say originally, rather than just come at it with my own interpretation and just add that to the mix of competing and chaotic interpretation wars? Why don't I just try to actually go back to see what it really said for real, which is an emphasis on truth, as the capital T, truth, rather than the lowercase t, my truth. It's the truth. So
Yeah, people like Justice Alito, Justice Scalia are champions of an alternative approach to hermeneutics interpretation, which they call originalism. And we can be very grateful that right now they are in control of the Supreme Court. They have a majority, but not by much. And the originalism, most of the law professors in the law school who are training the guys who will someday replace these guys when they retire or die, are teaching what they call the living constitution theory, which is simply taking this readers create meaning idea and applying it to legal text. And so, this is this is a battle that's being fought out on multiple stages. Okay. In the secular academy, the subjectivists, the relativists have pretty much taken over. They dominate it. They control the tenure committee, and they control who gets hired. It's really, really difficult if you forthrightly champion originalism in the interpretation of literature. It's almost impossible for you to get hired to teach literature. And the same thing happens in other disciplines. And unfortunately, as I was saying before, Christian institutions aren't necessarily an alternative. It's actually more dangerous there because your guard isn't up. You know, if I'm in the secular university, I'm expecting the Bible to be attacked. I'm expecting the authority of God not to be respected. People in Christian schools, their guard isn't up, and they get a slightly more subtle version of this stuff because the professor doesn't know any better. Uh, there are a place or two now, like maybe Baylor, that you can go to get a master's or a doctorate, but practically places where you can get a PhD in literature are practically non-existent. That is, places where you can get a PhD in literature that does not aggressively teach deconstruction, reader response, the subjective type of reader response criticism, etc. Practically non-existent. And so
Wow.
you end up, it ends up getting into Christian schools because the way they have evolved is the pressure on them to raise money in order to just survive. You know, the qualification for being the president of a Christian college or seminary has very little to do with understanding these things theologically and being able to have a role of pastoral guidance, leadership, and maintaining the standards. You get hired to be president mainly because you're successful at raising money. Now, at Tacoma Falls, where I taught, we had a doctrinal statement, and everybody on the faculty had to sign it annually. But the erosion of meaning applies to that document too. You have people who will tell you that they believe in the inerrancy of Scripture, and they sign that statement every year saying that they believe in the inerrancy of Scripture, and then they write books in which they say that the gospel writers made stuff up. It's like, wait a minute. And they don't see the contradiction because our ability to be held to any kind of standard by a written or oral statement has just been eroded so badly. And people sadly don't realize that there's even an issue unless they listen to the philosophical cowgirl, of course.
Well, that's one of the reasons I wanted to do this because it's not talked about very much and it
Yeah.
is everywhere. And we just assume that this is the way that it needs to be. And um, so going back to the Bible, the idea of hermeneutics in the Bible, this is I see this in, or have historically seen this in Bible studies as well, where the Bible study doesn't really study the Bible as much as each other's interpretations of the Bible. And that is, the question is always asked, what does that mean to you? Which, like you said, isn't in and of itself a bad thing
Mhm.
if it goes along with studying the Bible as it was intended to be interpreted.
Right. We need to ask what it means to us after we've established what it means. Not before, not at the beginning of the process. And It's not just English departments in Christian colleges that get corrupted this way, because the
Right.
guys who are teaching Bible, the guys who are teaching theology, the guys
Right.
who are teaching philosophy, guess who taught them how to read? Guess who taught them how to interpret text? And they've all picked up these same assumptions, again, often without realizing it. We didn't have a problem at Toccoa with people who were teaching this kind of thing, but we had a lot of people, some of our older Bible professors, very, very well equipped to handle the old uh, issues, to defend the Bible against the old higher criticism, but clueless about how to deal with the new hermeneutic, and not equipped to even recognize the way what they were saying was missing the kids in the class, because those kids had these different assumptions that weren't being dealt with. And so we were teaching what would have been a perfectly good hermeneutics class for students of 50 years ago, but not being as effective as we needed to be in dealing with the current issues, because yeah, you've got to keep up, and it's hard work to do that.
Right. Well, let me ask you a couple questions about the practicality of this. How do you think that this way of reading texts and this way of gathering information um, affects relationships and affects our ability to handle conflict in those relationships?
Yeah, listening is a challenge anyway, because we're selfish and we care more about making our point than we do about understanding the other person's point of view.
Yeah.
But if you are assuming that there's no objective meaning, if you spent your whole life not looking for the author's or the speaker's meaning, but just focused on how it affects you, then this difficult job of listening becomes even harder. Becomes even harder to do it in a constructive way, so that that real respect, mutual respect, is established. That we really care about what each other has to say and about getting it right, and instead of just moving on to justifying ourselves. So I'm not an expert on that side of it. Uh, I don't know any more about that than anybody else, but I can see that whatever problems I have in interpersonal communication to start with would be infinitely worse if I were coming at it with this set of assumptions.
Hmm. Yeah, that's absolutely true. Um, do you think that this is one of the things that contributes to people seeing the same event or seeing the same news story and interpreting it differently and seeming to live on different planets with how they see what has happened or what is happening?
Well, yeah, it certainly contributes to that. And we've got a problem with that anyway, because of the way news is reported, which unsurprisingly is not as trustworthy as it used to be. I mean, it's the people have a problem with authority for a reason, is because it's a lot of the so-called authorities in their lives uh, don't really deserve their trust. I can recall the first time that I was at an event that was newsworthy and reported on the news. And so I could compare my own eyewitness response to the image that was presented on the news. I was at an anti-abortion rally in Atlanta. This was some years ago, and the problem has only gotten worse since, but it was bad enough then. So we had this anti-abortion rally. We had a silent march on the anniversary of Roe versus Wade that ended at the steps of the state capitol. where our then governor, who was a believer, addressed the group. And so there were about 2,000 people in this march, the silent march to memorialize and remember the children who had died as a result of abortion. And of course, the pro-abortion people knew that this was going to happen, and so they collected a group of hecklers, about maybe 50 or 100, against a couple of thousand. And so when this was, so I got home that evening and watched it on the news, and the camera angles gave the impression that the two groups were about equal in size, about 20-1 difference. Okay. But where was the reality at this point in the heads of the few thousand people who had been there? And where was the image? It was in the heads of the hundreds of thousands of people who watched the news. And where was the reality? It was inside the heads of a few thousand people who within a few decades were going to be gone. The image was recorded and archived to be replayed as often as anybody wanted to until the collapse of the civilization that had made that recording technology possible. And so what chance does the truth have against the image that's been created? Okay. Well, this is a problem with everything you see from the media, because the potential is there. And so if your confidence in the existence of a real truth has already been undermined by these kinds of philosophy and these kinds of approaches to reading, then what chance do you have? People just give up the attempt to try to determine the objective real truth and say it's nothing but conflicting images anyway. I might as well just pick the ones that I like and the ones that advance my agenda and make that my truth, because what's the realistic opportunity I even have to do anything different? Why would somebody do the hard work of trying to figure out the actual truth living in a society that runs like that? Most people aren't going to do it. And they're therefore very susceptible to manipulation. If you haven't read George Orwell's 1984, which is a book that in a fictional world describes a world that operates this way even more systematically than ours does, it's not a pleasant read. It's a very challenging read, but it really opens your eyes to the problem that we face in this post-truth world. There are lots of reasons why people have just accepted that it's a post-truth world and there's nothing we can do about it.
Mm-hmm.
And the things we've been talking about are one of many factors that have gone together to create this situation.
Right. And the funny thing there is that it's a post-truth world, as a quote, is self-refuting because it's a truth claim. So if it's true, it's false, which is just so funny, which is
Is it
great.
true that it's a post-truth world?
Yes, exactly. Well, a couple of other questions then. Going back to reading, how can we read better then? So if you were our teacher, our professor, how would you help be the antidote for this?
Well, yeah, I certainly tried to be. And it starts with just caring about truth and letting your students see that you do. And then you show them by uh, by going into the text and looking at the details of it to show that it is possible to determine what it means. I've mentioned Huck Finn a couple of times. That's a story that a lot of people have read. Here's a big controversy that is taken to be pretty much unresolvable. Whether or not Huck Finn is a racist book, there is a group that basically, and I'm oversimplifying a little bit, but just to get the idea across. There's a group that basically says Huck Finn is a racist book because it contains the N word. End of discussion. You know, there was an alternative view that says no, Huck Finn is a profoundly anti-racist book because, Huck starts out as a racist like everybody else in his society, but then his experience of getting to know Jim on the raft as they're floating down the river convinces him is that Jim is an actual person, a human being. And he's been taught that because the black man is an escaped slave, and he's been taught that he needs to turn Jim in, that he'll go to hell if he doesn't. And there's this moment where Huck says, all right, then I'll go to hell, meaning he's sacrificing his own soul for Jim's freedom because he can't deny any longer that Jim's a human being. And it's one of the most wonderful ironies, All right, then I'll go to hell. At the moment, when for the first time in his life, he cares more about what's right than about what he wants. And so, which of these interpretations is correct? Now, if you've bought into readers create meaning, you can't answer that question. People can argue about it all they want to. But when he wrote the book, go to the scene. You take the students along with Huck and Jim on the raft, and you read that and say, okay, why is the N word here? Is it because Twain is a racist, or is it because that would have been the way people of that generation at that time talked? And if he had not put it there, it would have undermined the realism of his depiction. And if you stack that up against what we see here, the scenes are there. The words are there. They say what they say. And the people who accuse this book of racism and say it should be removed from the high school library are being incredibly superficial in pursuit of their agenda. And the people who say, that's just the most anti-racist book ever, are the ones who are actually letting the text as it is written speak to them and hearing it. And so you take them through that and show them, and you can make progress. Of course, my students and yours put together are a tiny drop in the bucket of what's happening across the entire culture. And so you start by doing that. Then the next thing you have to do is discipleship. It's Paul says to Timothy, you need to teach this to faithful men who will be able to teach others also. And so inspiring some of those guys to become missionaries to the secular academy, equipping them to go through a PhD program without being corrupted by it, come out and be able to get jobs and get tenure. And, you start with what you can do, and you try to create a network that's capable of expanding in that way. And then you pray for revival, because I don't think we're going to be able to turn this around based on our human effort alone, however intelligently planned and strategized and well conceived and executed it is. But certainly we have to do what we can, model an approach to truth that cares about it and that shows the fruits of the fact that if you actually let a good book like Huck Finn speak to you, it does so on a level which means that your own subjective experience reading the book is magnified, ironically. You can stay on that superficial level that just reacts to the presence of a word with no context, or you can enter into a reading experience that blows you away. And one approach to reading is conducive to one result, and the other one is conducive to the other. And that's something that's worth noticing. So, in ourselves, with our families, then with our students, those of us who have students, with our friends, yeah, we've got to let people see in our lives the difference that faithful reading is capable of making.
Right. And it's so exciting to have the prospect of going out there and discovering meaning that's outside of us, going out there and reading and finding out what it means. That is so much more exciting to me anyway than reading just
You
to see what you think about it, to see how you respond to it. Because that's so limited. I have only so many responses.
Is the book a mirror or a window? Now, it has the potential to be a window uh, if you are into faithful reading. It's almost hindered from being anything more than a mirror if you're into uh, readers creating their own meaning. And it's unavoidable. There's a fork in the road here. And as Yogi Berra said, when you find a fork in the road, take it.
Yes. Well, that is good stuff. I think that that's a good place to stop for now, even though I feel like we could go forever on this because there's so much there. But I really appreciate your time. Thanks for doing this.
I am glad to have the opportunity. It's good to get back in touch with you. And I've never had a conversation with the philosophical cowgirl that wasn't profitable and wasn't enjoyable. So
Well, thank you.
I hope, as far as recording them and inflicting them on others, that this will just be the beginning.
Good. Excellent. Well, we'll have to do it again sometime.